Mr. President, distinguished members of the council. I'm here to speak today about the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline that took place 1 year ago on September 26, 2022. Four explosions ruptured the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines that carried natural gas from Russia to Europe. It was the biggest act of industrial sabotage in human history, severing the main artery for energy from Russia to Germany, cheap energy that was critical to maintaining Germany's industrial base. We have heard every cockamamie and ridiculous theory on how this happened. Now, you don't need to be a genius investigative reporter to figure out who was the culprit of the Nord Stream attack. Incredibly, most Western news outlets ignore the fact that the President of the United States, Joe Biden himself, announced on February 9th, 2022, that he would in fact attack the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, saying, and I quote, "If Russia invades Ukraine, tanks crossing the border again, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We will bring an end to it. I promise you, we will be able to do it." Even with that pre-admission of guilt from the President of the United States, most of the Western press remained baffled as to who could have pulled off the greatest act of eco-terrorism in history. Well, luckily, we don't have to rely on my interpretation of President Biden's clear threat to attack the pipelines. We actually have Seymour Hersh, a genius investigative reporter with impeccable reputation and credentials, who reported that in June of 2022, United States Navy divers operating under the cover of a widely publicized summer NATO exercise known as Baltops 22 planted the remotely triggered explosives that 3 months later destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines, according to a source with direct knowledge of the operational planning. And like all criminals, the perpetrators could not contain their elation over committing the crime. Shortly after the attack, many high-ranking U.S. officials could not help but brag about their achievements and expressed multiple times how they were proud of being able to put an end to the pipelines. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland said, "I am, and I think the administration is, very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea." The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken called it a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy. You have to be a paid liar to not acknowledge the hand of the United States in carrying out these attacks. Not only did President Biden declare he would do this, but high-ranking U.S. officials have said similar things for years. We can look to 2014 when former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice stated that over the long run, you simply want to change the structure of energy dependence. You want to depend more on North American energy platforms, which is what this is really all about.
Jimmy Dore appears at the UN Security Council to give this speech on the Nord Stream pipeline, establishment corruption, and it was absolutely fantastic. Now, he had to tamper down the usual Jimmy Dore way of, very in-your-face sort of speaking style because he's in a different setting. So, of course, because a lot of us have heard a lot of what he's saying about the Nord Stream pipeline, but just packaged a different way. And he just repackaged it for a more professional audience, something that's going to be likely recorded in some sort of government log or something like that, like they do for C-SPAN. So this is great. Let's listen a little more and then comment, and we'll get on to some of our other stories. But let's listen to a little more of what Jimmy says here. He points out already how Joe Biden and Condoleezza Rice have already given signals, hints, have said how they wanted to transition from energy. And Joe Biden even takes it further to say, oh, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. So could it be the ultimate, or one of the ultimate goals was to get rid of that pipeline And the way to get rid of that pipeline is to say, hey, if Russia invades Ukraine, that shit's over. And what you do, you instigate or you entice Russia to invade. So it's very sneaky and sinister.
An economic war between the West and Russia in order to fill the pockets of rapacious capitalists who actually pull the strings of the U.S. government and dictate foreign policy. So let's pull back and take a look at the context in which this pipeline bombing occurred, shall we? It's all happening under the guise of defending Ukraine from an unprovoked Russian invasion. But of course, that's only true if you start the story of the Ukraine war somewhere near the end of the story instead of the beginning, which would indict Ukraine, the US, and NATO. The US and NATO are to blame, which is why the Western media always leaves the origin of this conflict out of their coverage and leaves most people in the dark with a false version of the cause of the conflict. Most Americans believe that Vladimir Putin woke up one day and decided for no particular reason to invade Ukraine and start a war completely out of the blue. This is what supporters of the Ukraine in this war actually believe, because that's the only narrative they hear from their news media, which is funded by the people who profit off this war, the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel companies in the West, and of course, Wall Street. To make a crude analogy of the Western media's coverage of the Russian invasion is the following. Let's say Vladimir Putin was standing on a bus stop and there was an old lady standing in the street and a bus was heading straight for her. So Vladimir Putin pushes the old lady out of the way of the oncoming bus and down onto the concrete sidewalk. The Western corporate media would start that story near the end saying, Russian president pushes old lady down onto the concrete. The same goes for the entirety of the Ukraine.
I think that's a very good analogy in this setting. Because well, I don't need to give an explanation. I think it's self-explanatory, but I'm glad that he didn't just go off of the facts. He says, well, let me give you an analogy of what this would be like. So if you just can't see because when you're in it, sometimes you can't see the broad concept. So that's why analogy is always good. And JB always has the best ones, but Jimmy right here has a pretty good one. Let's get back to the video.
Ukraine-Russian war. The Western media starts the story of the war at February 24th, 2022, which is definitely not when this conflict started. They leave out the 2014 coup of the democratically elected Ukraine government, orchestrated by the CIA in conjunction with Ukraine Nazis. They leave out the fact that the Russian-speaking ethnic population in the eastern part of Ukraine, known as the Donbass, didn't want to go along with the CIA Nazi coup government. And so the newly coup right-wing Ukraine government started shelling the citizens of the Donbass via their henchmen, known as the Nazi Azov Battalion, that ended up killing somewhere around 18,000 civilians in the Donbass. They leave out also there was a peace agreement that was reached to end the shelling by the Ukraine government and the Nazi Azov Battalion, known as the Minsk Accords, because the people who broke that peace agreement was not Russia, but the Ukraine government and the Nazis. They leave out the fact that there was already an overall peaceful way to avoid war and the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of precious Ukrainians, which was recently admitted.
I really wonder, being that these people in the UN, they're really immersed inside the Beltway propaganda, the bubble, if you will. I wonder if some of them, this is the first time they're hearing these details about 2014, 2015 with the US CIA-backed coup of democratically elected Ukraine president. So I wonder if they're all like, what? Or if this is kind of like, we already knew this. But I wonder how did Jimmy get here? I wonder, that would be a question that I would have. I wonder how Jimmy got it. Let me